Hallo alle zusammen. Mein Name ist Rosa von Sozialismus von unten. Schön, dass ihr alle gekommen seid zu der Veranstaltung von Sozialismus von unten. Sozialismus von unten ist eine revolutionäre Organisation, aktiv in ganz Deutschland. Wie der Name schon sagt, ist die Perspektive, einen Sozialismus von unten aufzubauen, für gesellschaftliche Veränderungen, für ein System, für Menschen statt Profite. Und das wird eben nur von unten erkämpft und nicht durch staatliche Reformen von oben herab. Genau. Für uns ist dieses Ziel, kämpfen wir für dieses Ziel eben in Betrieben, in Unis und Bewegungen und eben auch in der queeren Bewegung. Für mich und für viele andere queere Menschen in Deutschland war Ende 2024 ein riesiger Erfolg. Es bedeutete für uns Jahre oder ein Ende von Jahren der Pathologisierung durchs deutsche Gesetz. Wir mussten vorher noch mehrere psychologische Gutachten erstellen. Es musste Gerichtsurteile geben, damit wir uns endlich im Gesetz für den Namen und den Namen eintragen konnten, der eben unserer ist. Dem ging nicht eben einfach, genau, das wurde eben erkämpft durch einen jahrelangen Kampf von Transpersonen. Über Jahre hinweg haben wir versucht, dafür einzustehen. Wir haben in Parlamenten dafür gekämpft, wurden dort angefeindet. Tessa Ganserer zum Beispiel ist ein gutes Beispiel dafür. Wir haben auf der Straße dafür gekämpft und irgendwann haben wir dann eben Ende letzten Jahres es geschafft, dass das Selbstbestimmungsgesetz, obwohl es da immer noch einzelne Fehler gibt und es nicht ausreicht, eben dieses Recht für uns geschaffen, dass wir endlich selbstbestimmt unsere Namen ändern können auf eben den, der unseren eben entspricht. Genau. Gleichzeitig gab es aber auch zu derselben Zeit ungefähr massive Angriffe auf queere Menschen, auf CSD, eben nicht nur, wie es vorher war, einfach in Osteuropa, sondern eben auch in Deutschland, in auch Westdeutschland, in Gebieten, die sich eigentlich sehr fortschrittlich geben, wurden eben queere Menschen von Nazis, von offen rechtsradikalen Menschen angegriffen. Und das kommt auch nicht von ungefähr. Es entsteht unter anderem in Parlamenten, wo Nazis, wo die AfD, wo aber auch Merz gegen queere Menschen hetzt, wo auf eine Gefahr von Gender-Gaga, eine Unsichtbarkeitmachung von Frauen irgendwie gemunkelt wird, um queere Menschen eben zu kriminalisieren. Und nicht zuletzt ist es jetzt auch so wie Merz es mehrfach angesprochen hat, ein Vorhaben der CDU, eben dieses Selbstbestimmungsgesetz wieder aufzuheben. Aber es ist eben nicht nur ein nationaler Kampf oder eine nationale Unterdrückung, sondern sie findet eben überall statt und ich glaube in keinem anderen Land so sehr wie eben in Großbritannien. Deswegen haben wir als Sozialismus von unten von der Socialist Worker Party Laura Miles eingeladen und ich würde ganz kurz Laura Miles auf Englisch vorstellen. Laura Miles is a long-standing member of the Socialist Worker Party in England, author of Transgender Resistance, Socialism and the Fight for Trans Liberation. A retired lecturer and former National Executive Committee member of the colleague union in the UK. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yeah? You can hear me okay? Yeah. Yeah, okay. Thanks very much for the introduction, Rosa, and I'm very pleased to be here. Very interested to hear about the legislation passed in your parliament fairly recently. Let's hope that it doesn't come under attack and get rolled back. I have to say, as I'll go on to say shortly, things are much worse in the UK and in the United States. I guess to some extent that reflects an unevenness. In some places around the world, trans rights have made advances in the past few years, whereas in other places they've clearly been rolled back. So I'm going to talk about the political and ideological context of the rights attacks on LGBT rights, LGBT plus rights in general, but particularly the attacks on trans rights and on so-called transgender ideology, which seems to mean that anybody who is a trans person, a trans activist, or who is a supporter of trans rights is somehow being duped by this transgender ideology, which seems to be a kind of a subset of the gender ideology which Trump and the right wing and the fascists go on and on about, and which in their eyes needs to be rolled back. As far as I can see, gender ideology simply means supporting the right of women's equality at its very basic level, and something that we as socialists obviously pursue and fight for. The moral panic about trans people and trans rights that we're experiencing in a number of countries is very dangerous, deeply damaging, and a central element really of the far right's targeting of what they call woke culture. Trump's executive order on the 28th of this month, just was it yesterday or the day before, which is an attempt to completely outlaw any support and healthcare for trans youth in America, in effect to eradicate trans people's existence, is of course just one executive order of over 200 of these, which he lost no time in signing immediately the day he was the day he became president. These are all, these are executive orders which are demanding migrant deportations, closing US borders, cutting foreign aid, attacking diversity and equality regulations, and on and on and on. And we've just seen him just yesterday publicly blame equality and diversity policies for the Washington air accident in which 67 people died yesterday. His pardoning of 1,500 far-right thugs and criminals following the July the 6th insurrection at the Capitol was predictable, but outrageous. What's going on is a further ramping up of the attacks on trans and non-binary people's rights and lives that have been accelerating over the past 10 years or so, especially in the UK and the US, but also in countries where authoritarian and right-wing regimes have been in power. Brazil, Hungary, Poland, Russia. And these are very well funded. They're supported financially by particularly American foundations like the Heritage Foundation, like the Alliance Defending the Family, the Koch brothers, and so on. And certainly in the UK, a number of the transphobic organisations that have been formed in the last 7 or 8 years particularly, and the court cases that they've been pursuing to undermine trans healthcare in particular, have been supported by these far-right American organisations. The previous Conservative government here in the UK, the governments, we've had 4 prime ministers, by the way, in about 4 years before the last election, which brought the Labour Party into power. So the governments under Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss and Johnson, they backtracked very markedly on the Tory party's previous commitment to update the Gender Recognition Act that we have in this country, which was passed actually more than 20 years ago now, in 2004, and they were also committed to banning conversion therapy for both gay and trans people. They rode back on both of those, what were actually manifesto commitments back in 2019. And that issue, the whole issue of banning conversion therapy and the question of introducing self-identification for trans people so that we can change our birth certificates, by rather than have to go through a medical assessment and have diagnoses by psychiatrists and so on. This would simply be a legal question, and that was rolled back on and has been put very much on the back burner. And unfortunately, under the Labour government that was elected back last June, it's also very much still on the back burner, and we've heard nothing about these really since the election. None of this, of course, is unconnected to the relentless press and media promotion of negativity and outright hostility towards trans people by gender critics, largely in the absence of any countervailing trans voices, it has to be said. We very rarely hear trans voices in the media in the UK. And all this is happening in a broader context of deepening and repeated crises for the capitalist system. Examples like the recent Los Angeles fires, global warming, the imperialist and sub-imperialist wars, rising racism, Islamophobia, and increasing attacks on oppressed groups. The right are attempting to roll back the gains of recent decades made by the struggles of women, LGBT plus people, the Black Lives Movement, etc., amid rising inequality and poverty. That's their answer to capitalist crises and catastrophe. Ideologically driven moral panics and vicious hostility to trans lives and LGBT plus people in general are being stoked both by the religious and the secular right and far right. Far-right populism and fascism are on the march, becoming mainstream and even achieving power, not just potentially in Germany and Australia, which you're having to address, clearly, but with Trump's re-election, Giorgia Meloni as Prime Minister in Italy, the threat of the Rassemblement National in France, Le Pen in France, and the growth of a new racist party, Reform, in the UK, which some polls, they won several MPs in the last election in June, by the way, and some polls are now putting them equal to or ahead of the governing Labour Party in popularity. You've got elections soon in which immigration, as we've seen today in the German Parliament, is a key issue, and the fascist threat is very real. There's a huge political polarization going on, the decline of the middle political ground, but the momentum is clearly with the fascists and the far right at the moment, and the left is often still dispersed and lacks coordination after the failures of various left electoral projects over the past 10 years or so in Europe, Podemos, Syriza, and so on, and the capture of various radical left elements and movements by the Democrats in the United States. You'll probably be aware of the racist riots that happened in the UK last autumn. And there were, by the way, also a series of fascist and far-right mobilizations to try and stop drag queen story hour events, which we were involved in resisting, including where I live in Leeds. We had a very successful mobilization against an attempt to stop that happening last year. The riots were, they were awful. A real wake-up call. Essentially they were pogroms where, people were trying to burn down refugee hotels. But we subsequently managed to mobilize against them and block any more from happening the following week through Stand Up to Racism. But there's another as it happens, there's another Tommy Robinson march in London, and a counter-protest organised for tomorrow. See how that goes. But you know, Tommy Robinson is clearly aiming to build a street fascist movement, you know, through these kind of marches and so on. And it could be a big march tomorrow. So you know, fingers crossed. In the UK, we're also, as I said earlier, we're now faced with a Labour government under Keir Starmer, and Labour's position on the trans issue is really deeply worrying. Instead of standing with the limited rights that you know, trans people have enshrined in UK legislation, I mentioned the Gender Recognition Act already, but also the Equality Act, where you know, trans rights have parity and equal protection with women's rights, LGBT rights, and so on, religious rights and so on. Instead of standing with those, Starmer and co have wriggled and backslid in the face of transphobic propaganda, and have increasingly signalled that they'll throw trans people under the bus. And this is now real, as they've banned puberty blockers permanently now. The Tories banned them temporarily just before the election, and the Health Secretary in the UK has now made that ban permanent. And they're committed to implementing the deeply transphobic recommendations in the Cass report, which was a major 4-year, very flawed actually, study of healthcare for trans young people in particular. I don't know if people have heard of the Cass report. You probably have. Unfortunately, it's also being used abroad, outside the UK, as a means to try and undermine healthcare for trans youth as well. And this is inevitably driving up desperation, depression, and suicidality. The rate of suicide and attempted suicides amongst trans youth has shot up in this country in the last 2 or 3 years. Labour's willful ignorance of sex, gender, and gender identity means, like all the transphobes and gender critics, they wrongly counterpose trans rights with women's rights. Trans people are not now and never have been a threat in single-sex spaces. There's no evidence of this, however much the transphobes, so-called gender critics, and whole sections of the press and the mass media might claim. This fear of trans, as Judith Butler rightly points out in their recent book, Who's Afraid of Gender, a book I would certainly recommend, is a phantasm conjured up by the right and far right to try and lock people more deeply into the dominant capitalist ideology of the nuclear family, church and state, and traditional family roles and values. This whole attack on what they call woke and gender ideology, also of course on multiculturalism and minority rights, is at heart about the ruling capitalist class defending their political and economic domination, ultimately to enable them to continue in power, and carry on exploiting our labour power to maximise their profits and maintain their system. These reactionary moral panics, which are common in times of capitalist crisis, have been growing more strident as ways to attack the working class and fragment solidarity and unity between oppressed and exploited groups. So-called gender ideology has become the great evil, and identity politics and woke are to be reviled and attacked. But this is a smokescreen put up in order to attack women's and LGBT plus people's hard-won rights. All of this, what's often described as the culture war, is not so much a culture war as class war, to divide and demoralise our side and make us less united in our collective resistance to racism, sexism, homophobia, and transphobia, and crucially, less able to fight back. As I said earlier, this moral panic about trans people, especially trans young people's affirmative care and their right to live their lives without harassment and hostility, is not restricted to the UK. In the United States, in 2023, there were 510 anti-trans state-level bills which were introduced. A lot of them were passed, by the way, attacking affirmative healthcare for trans young people, attacking their participation in sports, attacking the use of gender-appropriate changing rooms and toilets, and attacking school support for the social transition of pupils, and on and on and on it went. In 2024, last year, there were 573 such bills, and the tide is not going to stop unless we can build the resistance and the united fronts that we need to roll back the reaction. So what should the starting point be for socialists? We start by recognizing that the war on trans is a class issue and goes to the heart of the ideology of the nuclear family and the cis-normative, heteronormative, sex essentialist and binary gender assumptions deeply embedded in capitalist society and in what Marx described as the social relations of production and reproduction. In other words, how we as workers are organized in capitalism, how the next generation of workers is produced and socialized. Marxists understand that the oppression of both women and LGBT plus people in class societies have the same roots. That means we should recognize that trans liberation and women's liberation go hand in hand. One cannot be achieved without the other. Both can only be won ultimately by the majority working class overturning the rule of the minority capitalist class. Oppression has to be fought on the basis of the most unified revolutionary struggle for liberation that can be achieved. How we build united fronts is central to doing that. Marxists start from the basic Bolshevik position, actually, of unequivocal, unconditional solidarity with all the oppressed and exploited. Marxism is the theory and practice of human liberation. It's indispensable to humanity's successful struggle for liberation if we're to avoid existential crises and repeated catastrophes for human civilization and ultimately a regression into barbarism. Barbarism is lapping at our feet. Our fight can't be merely economistic, restricted to fights over wages, conditions, and so on. Our Marxism understands how crucial it is to fight both exploitation and oppression in order to banish barbarism. What that means practically is that we can't put off actively fighting racism, sexism, transphobia, and so on until after the revolution. We have to be what Lenin described as tribunes of all the oppressed and exploited, a principle that the Bolshevik Party put into practice after the successful 1917 socialist revolution in Russia. Promoting successful united fronts also means recognizing that the working class is the only possible agent of socialist transformation, because workers' labor power is the only source of the capitalist system's profits. That's why we insist that class and class struggle is so crucial. Class is not just another dimension of power relations and oppression in capitalism. The working class has the power, if we're organized and determined enough, to cut off the flow of profit, and so has the potential power to assert its class interests, which inherently includes an end to oppression as well as an end to exploitation. The class has the power to throw back the attacks on class unity, the attacks on trans people and all the oppressed, as well as the attacks on pay, pensions, living standards, the social wage, and so on. I want to say a word really about identity theories. I've sketched out, I think differentiates our approach from that of people who accept one or other form of identity theory, like privilege theory, in trying to understand trans oppression and to resist transphobia. Unfortunately, identity theories consistently play down the role and importance of class and class struggle. Despite that, and I think this is absolutely crucial, really, we should be clear that we want to stand shoulder to shoulder with people who accept identity theories, because we're all under attack together from the right. we need to stand together to fight the attacks, however tricky tactically that can be at times. It requires working where we can with reformists, with autonomists, and so on. In doing this, we need to be both with and against those who accept identity theory. We stand together, but we also argue our position. Identity theory's basic flaw, I think, is that it sees a person's identity category, whether that's trans or gay or a woman or black, as the most fundamental thing about us. And that can lead, I think that can lead it to be inward looking and to overemphasize individual or consciousness raising solutions, really, rather than collective solutions, which is what we're advocating. What can we learn from our history? One of the things that we can learn, we must learn, is just how much the organizations of the working class, trade unions and socialist organizations have been crucial in the fight against sexism and violence against women, for women's rights, against racism, and yes, actually for LGBT plus rights as well as obviously for better pay and pensions, paid holidays, protections at work, and so on. So for example from the UK here, in the fight against Section 28, which was a really nasty piece of homophobic legislation under the Tories in the 1980s, the fight against that from the late 1980s right through to 2003, trade unions were prominent in the protests and demonstrations and in putting pressure on the Labour government, Tony Blair's government at the time, to rescind that Section 28. So how do we fight back? I'll kind of finish on this really. Many trans and non-binary people and LGBT plus people in general are understandably scared and appalled at what's happening, particularly in the USA, but also here in Britain and in other places as well. But we need to remember, I think, that the majority of people, especially young people, are not transphobic, just as most people actually are not racist. So we need to firstly, I think, reject any despair or passivity or any temptation to look inwards or to think the answer lies in trans or LGBT plus separatism based on identity categories, not least because trans people and non-binary people are a very small minority of the population, and we can't win liberation just by ourselves. We have to work with other people, other oppressed groups, and the working class in general. At the same time, we know from history that reforms won within capitalism are never safe from attack. We only need to look at the period of the Weimar Republic and the subsequent rise of the Nazis, or of course, what's happening now with, I'm sad to say, the Tories and the Labour government in this country, and Trump and the MAGA people in the USA. Trans and LGBT plus rights, women's rights, can be stripped away if we don't fight back. Look at Roe v. Wade in the US 18 months or so ago. The people cheering that on are the same people cheering on attacks on trans and non-binary people and attacks on LGBT plus rights. So frankly, those people on the left, I think a minority on the left, who have supported gender critical ideas and organizations really, have a lot to answer for, because they've opened the door and enabled more of these attacks on broadly on LGBT plus people and on women, on women's rights. If we're going to turn the tide on this dire situation, we'll need, for a start, to learn from the Stonewall Rebellion of over 55 years ago now, that led to Pride, the Gay Liberation Front, and direct radical action by LGBT plus people, in which trans women like Sylvia Rivera and Marsha Johnson especially played very important roles. So crucially, we need to look to the power of the working class and to the fantastic social movements that we've seen in recent years, the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, and most recently, of course, the ongoing inspirational international movement in solidarity with the Palestinians and against the Israeli genocide in Gaza, aided and abetted by Western imperialism. We need strikes and occupations that challenge the bosses and the state and start to incorporate demands against oppression as well. We need to learn from the Russian Revolution and the Bolsheviks, who integrated the fights against anti-Semitism and racism, the fight for women's rights, for homosexual rights, and the rights for oppressed national minorities into their fight against the First World War and against Russian and international capitalism. Trans people, for the most part, of course, are part of the working class. It's not a difficult argument to put to folk that all these attacks are linked, and we should all be supportive of trans rights. This is where the unity against the right and the fascists must be built, where the attempts to ramp up the oppressive powers of the ruling class can be blocked and rolled back. Trade unions can be bulwarks against the hatred and moral panics about gender ideology and trans rights. We need to win our trade unions to actively support prides, trans prides, the various vigils, protests, and so on for trans rights. So that trans people, I think, and this can be a hard thing, it's not easy for people to do, but we need to be, wherever we can, we need to be out, we need to be proud, and we need to be loud. We need to flag up key questions like, who has the right to decide about trans lives and trans bodies? About, is it trans people or is it the state? Transphobes explicitly and implicitly are denying trans people's bodily autonomy and calling for greater state powers to control trans lives and their very existence. Their state power, if they win it, will inevitably be applied to women's reproductive rights, to LGBT plus rights in general, and then to the right to protest, as we're now seeing in the UK, where there's been a serious attempt that arrested various leaders of the Palestine March 10 days or so ago, the right to have independent trade unions and so on. And we have to say, all of us, I think, no, not the church and not the state. Trans people must decide their fate. We need to take the fight against transphobia to those in power in the UK, need to take that fight to the Labour government, to everywhere fight the bigots, to galvanise the resistance to the rights attacks. As well as building the resistance to transphobia in our unions, we need to be on the streets, we need to be picketing, certainly in the case of the UK, picketing the NHS, who have implemented these suspension of care for young trans people in particular. We need to be protesting, we need to be demonstrating. We need to build both the sword and the shield. We need to strengthen the shield of the trade unions and organisations to defend our rights, but we need a bigger, stronger sword as well. In other words, and I'll finish on this, if we're going to fight back and fight for working class and trans liberation, not just better rights, but liberation, we need a bigger revolutionary left as well. And I'll finish on that. Thank you.